Russian troops are refusing to fight, not in whispers, not in isolated desertions, but in the open, in broad daylight, under direct orders. Entire platoons and companies are laying down their weapons, turning their backs on their commanders, and accepting the consequences rather than walking into the meat grinder one more time. At 0430 hours yesterday, in the shattered tree lines west of Pokrovsk, a full Russian motorized rifle battalion, over 200 men, refused to advance across an open kill zone already lit up by Ukrainian FPV drones. Their officers screamed threats. Their own artillery began falling short to force them forward, and still they stood fast. This is not morale cracking. This is the front line of the Russian army physically breaking. Let that sink in for a moment. What you are witnessing is not a tactical hiccup. It is not soldiers getting cold feet. This is the visible, undeniable manifestation of a military system that has run out of lies, out of replacements, and out of any doctrinal answer to the war Ukraine is now fighting. I spent decades studying how armies move, how they break, and how they adapt. What is happening on that front line right now is the moment when the assumptions Putin built this entire campaign on finally meet the unforgiving mathematics of modern warfare. And they are failing catastrophically. This is not a story about a few scared conscripts. This is a story about why the Russian military model, mass artillery, and disregard for human life was always going to collapse the moment Ukraine turned the battlefield into a precision killing field. Pull the lens back. What looks like mutiny on the surface is actually the final proof that Russia has lost the adaptation race completely. And what happens next changes everything. Let me walk you through exactly how we got here, because the mainstream coverage is still treating this as isolated discipline problems. It is not. It is the logical endpoint of every doctrinal failure we have watched unfold for the last 3 years. Go back to the beginning. Before February 2022, the Russian general staff believed they were facing a hollow Ukrainian force that would collapse in 72 hours under the weight of massed armor, massed artillery, and massed conscripts. Their entire operational concept rested on 3 fatal assumptions. First, that quantity would always overcome quality. Second, that Ukrainian will to fight was paper thin and would evaporate once the first columns rolled across the border. Third, that their own soldiers, conditioned by fear, propaganda, and the promise of a quick victory, would absorb whatever casualties were necessary without question. Every single one of those assumptions has now been shredded by Ukrainian adaptation. By the summer of 2022, the first cracks were already visible. Russian assault groups were taking 70% casualties in single engagements around Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Yet Moscow kept feeding new waves into the same kill zones because they had no other playbook. Their doctrine never evolved. They doubled down. They called it meat assaults behind closed doors. Their own soldiers started calling it suicide, and still the orders came down from the top: advance or be shot. Fast forward to the winter of 2023-2024. The Wagner mutiny was the first public fracture, but it was not the last. It was merely the most visible. Behind the scenes, Russian commanders were already dealing with a quiet epidemic of refusals. Men who would rather face military tribunals than walk into Ukrainian drone corridors again. By the time Avdiivka fell in early 2024, the Russian army had burned through its initial contract soldiers, its mobilized reservists, and was scraping the bottom of the barrel with convicts, migrants, and North Korean fillers. Training standards collapsed, unit cohesion evaporated, and the one thing that kept the machine moving, fear of their own command, began to lose its grip. Now we arrive at the present moment. Over the last 90 days, Ukrainian forces have perfected a layered kill chain that makes Russian infantry assaults effectively impossible. First, reconnaissance drones map every trench line in real time. Then FPV drones, cheap, numerous, and piloted with surgical precision, hunt individual soldiers and vehicles the moment they expose themselves. Artillery and HIMARS follow up on anything that survives the initial wave. The result is not combat. It is systematic extermination. Russian troops are being asked to advance across open ground with no air cover, no effective electronic warfare, no counter-drone systems worth mentioning, and no realistic expectation of extraction if they are wounded. The conditions are literally inhuman, and the soldiers know it. What happened in that Pokrovsk sector yesterday is the textbook example. A battalion commander received orders to seize a tree line 2 kilometers away. The objective had zero tactical value beyond satisfying some quota from higher headquarters. Ukrainian drone operators had already been active over the area for 48 hours. The troops on the ground had watched 3 previous companies torn apart in the same sector, body parts hanging in the wire, vehicles burning for hours because no one could reach them. When the order came to move, the men simply refused, not with slogans, not with rebellion. They refused by sitting down in their fighting positions and stating calmly and clearly that they would not walk into that fire again. Their commander threatened execution. Some junior officers sided with the troops. Within minutes, the entire chain of command fractured. This is not indiscipline. This is doctrinal collapse made visible. Let me be very clear about what this proves at the tactical level. Russian doctrine still treats soldiers as interchangeable ammunition. Ukrainian doctrine treats every soldier as a force multiplier who must survive to fight another day. That asymmetry is now decisive. Russia cannot replace the men it is losing at this rate. Ukraine is turning every engagement into a masterclass in combined arms that Russia has no answer for. The hidden military variable here is not technology alone. It is the willingness of Ukrainian forces to innovate in real time, adapting drone tactics daily, integrating electronic warfare on the move, coordinating fires with surgical precision, while the Russian system remains rigid, top-down, and terrified of any deviation from the original plan. And it gets even more serious from here, because this refusal is not happening in a vacuum. It is happening while Russian logistics are already strained to the breaking point. Ammunition stocks are being rationed. Fuel convoys are being hunted by the same drones that are terrorizing the infantry. Commanders at the battalion level are now spending more time managing refusals and desertions than planning operations. The Russian Ministry of Defense has responded the only way it knows how, by doubling down on repression. New orders have gone out authorizing summary executions for refusal. Penal battalions are being formed at an accelerated rate, yet the numbers keep climbing. Independent monitoring groups tracking open source data are now reporting over 500 confirmed refusal incidents in the last 30 days alone. That is not sustainable. That is systemic failure accelerating. Pull the lens back to the operational level. What these refusals are really exposing is the complete bankruptcy of Russia's mobilization strategy. Putin promised a special military operation. He delivered a meat grinder that has now consumed over 700,000 Russian casualties by the most conservative estimates. The contract soldier pool is exhausted. The mobilized reservists from 2022 have either been killed, wounded, or rotated out, permanently broken. The new recruits, many of them from the poorest regions, many of them foreigners, are being thrown into the line with less than 2 weeks of training. They arrive at the front, see the reality of Ukrainian drone dominance, and the refusal cycle begins again. This is not an army anymore. This is a rotating roster of expendable bodies being fed into a machine that no longer works. The industrial and state-level consequences are now impossible to hide. Russia's defense factories are running 3 shifts, yet they cannot produce enough counter-drone systems, electronic warfare pods, or even basic body armor to protect their own troops. Their economy is being hollowed out by sanctions and war spending, yet the Kremlin keeps promising victory is just around the corner. Every refusal on the front line sends a signal back to the home front. This war is not winnable on current terms. Families are receiving the bodies or the absence of bodies in greater numbers. Social media inside Russia is filled with videos of mothers confronting recruiters. The propaganda machine is working overtime, but the footage from the front is louder. Soldiers recording their own refusals on smuggled phones are bypassing every censorship filter Moscow has built. This brings us to the climactic turning point we are watching unfold right now. In the last 10 days, Ukrainian forces have launched a coordinated drone and artillery campaign specifically designed to break whatever remains of Russian morale in the Donetsk sector. Over 400 FPV strikes were recorded in a single 48-hour window. Precision-guided munitions have destroyed more than 30 Russian command posts and ammunition depots behind the lines. The effect has been immediate and devastating. Entire forward positions are now reporting that their troops will not leave their bunkers even under direct orders. Commanders are begging for reinforcements that do not exist. The Russian high command is facing a nightmare scenario If they punish every refusal, they will have no army left. If they ignore it, the collapse spreads. They are trapped by their own doctrine. I have seen armies break before. I have studied every major conflict since the Second World War. What is happening on the Ukrainian front line right now follows the exact pattern of every military that has lost the will and the ability to adapt. The leadership lies to the troops. The troops discover the lie at the cost of their lives. The survivors refuse to participate any longer. The command structure then chooses repression over reform. And the cycle accelerates until the entire front begins to crumble. The real question is no longer whether Russian troops will continue to refuse. The real question is how long the Kremlin can sustain this level of internal pressure before the entire military edifice cracks wide open. Because every refusal is not just a tactical problem, it is a strategic infection. It spreads doubt up the chain of command. It forces Moscow to divert resources away from the actual fight and toward internal security. It signals to every potential recruit that this war is a death sentence, and it hands Ukraine exactly the kind of asymmetric advantage that wins modern wars, not through brute force, but through relentless pressure on the enemy's weakest point, the human element. What you are seeing is the inevitable outcome of a military that treated its soldiers as disposable from day one. Ukraine treats its soldiers as the most precious resource on the battlefield. That doctrinal difference is now producing results that no amount of Russian artillery or propaganda can overcome. The adaptation race is over. Ukraine won it decisively. Russia is still fighting the war it planned in 2021. Ukraine is fighting the war that exists in 2026. Let me issue a clear verdict here. The Russian army as an effective fighting force is reaching its terminal phase, not because it lacks weapons entirely, but because it lacks the one thing no amount of money or repression can buy back, the trust and willingness of its own soldiers to keep walking into certain death. Something inhuman is happening on that front line because the Russian command has made the conditions inhuman, and the troops have finally said enough. History will record this moment as the point where the myth of Russian military power finally died in full view of the world. Not in some grand decisive battle, but in the quiet, exhausted refusal of ordinary soldiers who realized their lives mattered more than Putin's delusions of empire. What happens next will not be simple. Moscow will attempt new waves of mobilization. They will escalate internal repression. They may even try limited nuclear signaling to distract from the collapse. But none of that changes the fundamental reality on the ground. The front line is breaking from within. Ukrainian forces are pressing the advantage with increasing confidence, and the Russian soldier who once feared his commander more than the enemy now fears the drones more than anything else. Stay with us because those questions, how far this collapse will spread, how Ukraine will exploit it, and what it ultimately means for the security of Europe, do not have simple answers. But one thing is certain. The war Russia started is now devouring the very army it sent to fight it. And that is a verdict the Kremlin cannot spin away. This has been Ben Hodges. The battlefield does not lie, and right now it is speaking with absolute clarity.